Welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be discussing navigating the middle game part 3. Some concrete examples of middle games, building on the principles we've learned in the first two videos. And I've got 5 examples here, so it'll be a decently short video, and I might make another video with more examples, but the next part will be creating counterplay. How to create counterplay when you're down from some like kind of lower level games where their defense isn't as solid as like the pros. But let's take a look at this first example. In this first example, it's black to move, and black has one really amazing move based on the principles we've talked about, and black has the move that they played in the game. So those are unfortunately two different moves. The amazing move is pawn to e5. The reason pawn to e5 is really good, it does block off the bishop, but it does also block off white's bishop. It creates a knight outpost, which is really strong. It locks up the center where the king is, so it makes the king a lot safer. And it stops white's counterplay of playing something like pawn to d4 to try to open up some lines for the rook and the queen. Okay, so sometimes making a plan in the middle game is all about just shutting down your opponent's counterplay. Sometimes that's actually a really big part of it. And me personally, if I feel like I have a huge advantage, which black doesn't in this game because there's still a lot that could happen. But if I feel like I have an advantage, sometimes I'll just like take some time and stop my opponent's counterplay before I like go in for the kill, because you know your attack could fizzle out and then you're done. Now white here wants to, because of this where this king is, white wants to open up the center. White also wants to open up the king side, but can really only do that by playing this and sacrificing the rook after the knight takes, but it's not going to be as good if the king stays in the center. So white definitely is in a really passive position here. But black played in the game bishop to e5, and unfortunately for black, this move unfortunately made all the difference. This move did not give any of those middle game benefits that we just discussed. And even though, yeah, there's this knight outpost here, it does what white exactly wants, which is open up the center for the strong queen and rook. And also this pawn is hanging. Okay. And now that also gives white more space. Okay. Here, this queen is a lot more restricted. Here, this queen is a lot more active. Okay, now white could play knight to b5, and then after pawn to a4, because black also wants to attack on the queen side where white's king is, which is, I mean, it's not a bad plan, but the problem is now white has a knight to d6 check, and black resigned. Even though this literally just wins one pawn, but it because if king moves like say here, this discovery is kind of thwarted by this, but it does pick up a pawn. Anyway, so yeah, you could see how like one move changed the entire course of the middle game, because black really wasn't cognizant of both players' plans. Black just kind of wanted to protect their knight with the first piece they had available and took 7 seconds on this move and ended up costing them the game. So let's look at this next example. In this next example, I'm black and I screw up, okay? Because even though I said that bishops are better than knights when pawns are on opposite sides of the board, I decide to trade the bishop for the knight so I could pick up this pawn. And now after pawn to g5, my activity is a lot more restricted, because this pawn controls these two, and yeah, I can trade it off, but it's not really that good. And now this bishop is going to be super strong. It like can go over here and be really strong this way. It can go here and then like kind of regroup itself here, something like anything. Also, this pawn is like kind of under attack too, but But if I just played knight to f6, attacking the pawn, um, like it gets my knight a little more active, and it keeps the bishop alive, so I can counter his bishop since pawns are on both sides of the board. Now the computer says if g5 now, then I have this and knight d5, but unfortunately, this is still a pretty tricky position for black to play, and this is just stockfish because like after something like bishop b2, or sorry, bishop a2. Oh, that's a huge blunder. But let's say like let's say black had this square protected, and that wasn't a fork. Okay, after bishop to a2, and if this square is actually protected and it's not a fork, then this bishop is just really strong. So so yeah, I'm trying to illustrate that example, but obviously there's a tactic there that like kind of shuts it down. Let's look at the next example. In this example, white has a much better pawn structure than black. So white wants to trade down into an endgame and also activate the rooks and try to exploit these weak pawns, especially on the king side, for a win. So that's why white plays knight to d3, attacking the bishop. Now black plays bishop to d6 because black wants to keep all these pieces on the board. Black wants to keep the bishop pair, and look, and black slowly makes improving moves. Unfortunately, rook to c3 isn't as strong of a move because this rook isn't really doing anything because this pawn's already protected by this pawn. So now black targets this pawn with the power of the bishop. Now white plays pawn to g3, which makes this diagonal super weak where the bishop is. And you can see the power of the bishop pair here. After pawn to e4, knight has to move out of the way. And well, you could take the pawn first, but then knight moves out of the way, and that's a free pawn because the bishop covers it. So as you can see, when you have the worst pawn structure, but you have superior pieces, such as the bishop pair, you want to keep these pieces on the board and see what kind of tactics you can come up with. And like we talked about middle game plans, but you always have to play for the tactics. That's like the number one thing. If you take away anything from this video, you have to see the tactics. That's why in this move, that knight to d5, after the knight to d5, you can't go bishop a2 because of that fork. So that is, you always have to keep an eye out for those. The best plans can always fall awry. That's what Of Mice and Men taught me. Now let's look at this position right here. We have a London against the King's Indian. Now, what black tried to do with that move is fianchetto the bishop, which is a pretty strong diagonal for it. But what white wants to do is trade this bishop. Like every time you're attacking a king with the fianchetto bishop, you always want to trade that off. Now the king is way weaker on the dark squares. That bishop is not helping on the dark squares. The queen can still go on the dark squares and attack. The knight can, but there's like these pawns are not covering dark squares. This knight's not covering dark squares. I mean, it can once it moves, but like you see the point. So white plays pawn to h4 to attack, and this is solid. White's plan is to attack the black king. The black's plan is to get some space back and attack the white king. Black plays bishop to b7 because that's why black played b6, and then pawn to f3, an inaccuracy. But the idea behind pawn to f3 is that it kind of shuts down this bishop, and that's kind of the idea of shutting down your opponent's counterplay. Not the best move because it allows black to kind of shut down the attack with h5. Black plays c5, trying to create space. Unfortunately, it just does not work. It's just too late. White plays pawn to d5, trying to lock the center, and it says it's a good move. We're not like, oh, this is the best. Like, this is we're not going to be like, oh, like just you have to play a top engine move every time. Like, no, like if you find a good plan and the computer says it's good, it's not a blunder, it's not an inaccuracy, it's not a mistake, then like you could play it, right? That F3 move was an accuracy. I was just saying the idea, but this pawn to d5 move shuts down this bishop even more, and it shuts down black's ability to kind of break out a little bit. Now black can try to break out with the e pawn, but it's a little more difficult because that does open up the king just a little bit more if this f pawn exchanges. So like this move locks up the center. It doesn't lock up the queen side, but it kind of does. And it's like, okay, white only wants play happening on this side. White wants to lock up the center, lock up the queen side. Queen to c7. Unfortunately, this doesn't really help black's problems with space or the king side attack. Pawn to g4, preparing pawn to h5. But black plays pawn to h5, and after some trades, now white is going to go for the attack. Rook moves in. Knight moves in to try to trade this strong knight off. That's a little intermediate move. Takes with check. Now rook takes back, and white does lose a pawn. However, now white's attack is looking really strong here. This king is going to be pretty open, especially if white gets really easy and takes a pawn. Now knight trades, and then after queen to g5, suddenly there is no defending this black king. Why is there no? This is mate in 5. Why is this mate in 5? Well, this rook can't really do anything, and like yeah, it can do that to delay the inevitable for a turn. But this rook is super passive. This queen is super passive. And although black did a pretty decent job at defending over here, black ultimately didn't address the issues of the lack of space here on the queen side, and in the center this queen had no activity, had no scope, and even with this pawn blocking the queen, once this pawn moves, the queen comes alive, which it does that turn. Now the queen comes alive, and white's activity is just stronger. And the plan, some people are like, oh, the plan is like, I'm going to target this pawn, I'm going to play this move, this move, this move, right? I don't want to go that deep, at least in this video. But I'm keeping these plans vague intentionally, but I'm just trying to illustrate how like you can take these vague ideas and try to apply them in a practical way. Even with just vague ideas, you don't have to like target a single pawn and like, oh, I'm gonna build up that pressure, because that's what I notice a lot in chess books. Anyway, side tangent over. Let's look at this game. In this game, black is up 2 pawns. They're doubled though. And has a slightly worse, actually a better pawn structure, because these double pawns, counter these double pawns. So black wants to trade as many pieces as possible, and white wants to keep the pieces on the board and try to target black's weaknesses. Also, the other thing white can do, because black is up 2 pawn, or is up 1 pawn right now after this pawn took. The other thing white can do is to try to trade down to an opposite colored bishop endgame, where there's minimal pawns on the board and just the bishops, because opposite colored bishop endgames are usually a draw. They're usually a draw, especially 1 pawn on the board, like guaranteed draw every single time, almost. And 2 pawns on the board, it's still tricky, but it's still pretty much a draw in a lot of circumstances. So that is a plan for white to do. Now, trading pieces kind of behooves both players, because it behooves black because they're up a pawn. It also behooves white to get down to that opposite colored bishop's endgame, because unfortunately white just doesn't have that much counterplay here. And okay, pawns get traded, and there's a pawn win for black. Now it all falls apart. So this is about like, this is also regarding like targeting weakness. This pawn is super weak. It's only protected by the knight. It only can be protected by the knight. This bishop can never defend it. So black targets it right away. And then after pawn to f3, Van Feingold does never play f3. That's why it's an inaccuracy. now this pawn falls. So you can see, like, you target the pawn at the base of the chain, everything falls. Now this pawn does fall. Black is only up one. Now this pawn falls. Okay. Now, okay. Now black is up 2 pawns. So black wants to trade pieces. It is an opposite color bishop endgame. And white can defend this pawn from promoting with this bishop always, right? But now black has to get a little creative to try to make some things happen. And also, this is a pretty decent setup. Your bishop and your pawn protect each other, so this king can never do anything about it. Black's got to try to get their king involved, do something. Winning that pawn also is a good start. But after this, all the pawns fall. And even though this is opposite color bishop endgame, white didn't preserve enough pawns. So that was really vague, but I wanted to show some concrete examples of some middle game ideas and kind of how they like came into action in these games. So this is a pretty long video, and I do apologize, and I do yap a lot, but I kind of just want to illustrate some of these concepts and how like some of these different concepts apply in each of these examples. And even though it was a little vague, I did that on purpose because I don't want to like go too like grandmaster into the weeds, because that's a big criticism I have. Is like some things is that some people are so good at chess that they just instantly get in the weeds, and we don't want to do that. You want to kind of build on itself and then get into the weeds later. So thanks for watching. If you watched all 16 minutes of this, 17 I guess, see ya.